Hello, Flawless family. I'm once again joined for a great conversation. And today I'm here with Dr. Ajita Robinson, who is a grief and trauma expert, a former full time professor and corporate executive who built a mental health practice to help people heal from generational trauma and loss. And she now continues to help other mental health entrepreneurs create a global impact. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Robinson.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you're in the mental health field, you're in the game, but I think it's still so important that we check in with you. So I want to ask, as tough as this year has been, how are you honestly and truly doing right now?
Honestly, tired. It's been an incredibly busy and heavy time. So it feels like all of my roles as a grief and trauma expert, as a parent, as a Black woman, are just merging together. And it's been a challenge to take my own advice regarding self-care and boundaries, to be honest with you.
And as you mentioned, being a Black woman, so us talking as Black people, we know that mental health is still something that is not always easy to discuss in our community. So, I want to ask, like, how did that affect you on a personal level? And then how did you still manage to have this interest in the field?
Yeah, so we still have some work to do as a Black community because there's still a significant stigma regarding mental health, but also there's barriers to accessing adequate care. So that problem is really twofold. And so we've made a lot of progress, but there's still work to be done. And so interestingly enough, both of my parents have worked in the mental health field. Really pretty much all of their careers. My mom's an addiction counselor and primarily works in prisons or did before she retired. And my father mostly trains individuals who have mental health challenges, pretty severe mental health challenges, re-enter the workforce. And so I guess I got it an exposure at a really young age. But I also had family therapy for the first time at 8 years old. And so that by with a Black woman psychiatrist in Los Angeles, which was like, wait, what? And so that was I was really, really resistant because I didn't understand why we had to go to therapy because I didn't need therapy, but we did need, to go to therapy as a family. And I later realized that. And so, but even with that experience, I had a interesting childhood experience with cumulative trauma. And so I talk about a lot that I essentially became who I needed. But it was an interesting road because I went to law school first. I did everything to prevent from being a grief trauma trauma therapist, right? Because part of doing this work requires that you deal with your own stuff. And I hadn't done my own grief and trauma work around my childhood trauma. And so I couldn't carry and hold space for others. And so I knew I wanted to work with kids who had, grown up in pretty terrible environments similar to what I kind of grew up in. And I thought I could advocate best for them in the legal system. And anyone that has been on that side of the terrain knows that anytime we have kids or folks entering the legal system, particularly our kids, trauma is in the mix. And so if we really want to make an impact, I had to kind of back up, right? And do some of the work that might help prevent them from encountering the criminal justice system. And so I had to pivot. Mid law school, I was like, dang it. All right. So
Wow.
sorry, that's how I kind of, did that work. And for me, it has just been life-giving work because I truly get to do work with folks that look like me, that have similar experiences, but that are on the other side. We found a way to thrive despite the sheer amount of chaos we may have been exposed to at a young age.
And I love your background, starting with how progressive it seems like your upbringing was to be 8 years old and being in a therapy session, especially with a Black psychiatrist. That's amazing. Also, to your work with the criminal justice system, because it's flawless. We kind of work at the intersection of education, mental health, and criminal justice reform. So I love that piece about you. But then you also mentioned access to care being an issue for our community. And kind of in response to that, there's been, in these challenges, there's been efforts made to try to bring more awareness to the cause. So I want to get your input on campaigns like last month's Minority Mental Health Month, which has, been transitioning to being referred to, Black, Indigenous people of color mental health month. So I just want to get your overall thought on like awareness months and campaigns and, which title with Minority Mental Health Month versus, BIPOC Mental Health Month? Like, which title do you think is more fitting?
Yeah, so I think I personally don't have a preference regarding the name. I do believe that it's important that we understand that 1 month of awareness is not sufficient to address the gap, not only in service, but in the growing disparities that marginalized groups face in our society. And so I generally talk about it from a marginalized group perspective because, whether we're talking about Black, Indigenous people of color who also have gender identity challenges and sexual orientation and other, some of these other characteristics that make their experience that much more unique and unshared, I think that it's important that we have some space to talk specifically about the experiences of Black, Indigenous people of color, especially in this climate, in this country, because of our legacy of oppression, white supremacy, systemic racism that acts upon these groups in a very different way than if you aren't a Black, Indigenous person of color and your primary identifier or your distinguishing character is gender identity or sexual orientation, but you operate in those spaces from a Eurocentric perspective. Your experience as a marginalized individual is different than those who have multiple marginalized characteristics. And for me, that isn't about comparing, it's about understanding that we often center whiteness even in amplifying struggles of minority and marginalized communities. And so when we talk about should we do this or that, I think sometimes it's a deflection, right? As opposed to wanting to be inclusive. And so I think that we have to create space for Black, Indigenous people of color to be centered. And I think this is what that particular month is designed to do. And so with that regard, I don't have a preference for name as long as the actions, the initiatives that are brought out as a result of amplifying that really centers the people that are most hidden in our country.
Wow, that's an amazing answer. But I want to dive more into your specialty, and I mean, just for everyone who isn't aware, that doesn't work in these spaces, I kind of want to get your definition of generational trauma. I think you also labeled as cumulative trauma. I don't know if those two terms are different, but I just want to get your overall definition of that and how it affects. You mentioned how it affects you personally. You had to, process that. How does it affect individuals?
Yeah, so generational trauma is slightly different from cumulative. Generational trauma is usually cumulative, but cumulative trauma is not always generational. So let's actually unpack that. So generational trauma is trauma that is transmitted through generations, across generations. We often talk about it as intergenerational trauma. And so in this country, this is something that impacts First People or Native people, as well as that's the Black, Indigenous people of color component, but specifically Black people who have a history of their ancestors being enslaved, right? And so some of the trauma that was endured as a result of slavery, of civil rights, of Jim Crow, those things required adaptation, both positive and not so positive, things that we do to survive. Well, that gets coded, even the maladaptive coding or experiences, narratives, coping strategies get encoded in our DNA. And so those things, both around coping, survival, the stories that gets passed down, the way that we parent and protect our children, or to parent to keep them safe in this country as brown people, as Black and brown people, all of those narratives and things get passed down from generation to generation, sometimes in ways that continues the trauma-induced behavior or responses. And so many of us as Black people can remember the time or a conversation when someone in our caregiving circle, whether it be a parent or a relative, that talked to us about what it meant to be Black and to go out into the world, whether it be when we first got our driver's license, whether it be being able to play a toy gun outside, or just running and not being suspicious, or going into stores. Those coded behaviors that we've learned and adapted to do were because not doing them, right, could make us unsafe, or literally could be the difference between us making it home that day. And so that is trauma that gets repackaged as coping and resiliency. But it shows up in the way that we parent our children, the way that we teach them to be safe and to be respectable, right? And polite, and to not be seen as a threat. And so it affects us as an individual because here's a good example. Many of my clients and my friends have heard the statement from somewhere, again, at a very young age, that as Black people, you have to work harder and be better just to be treated as equal. Maybe, right? This is a common thing. And so what does that do to us as individuals? It forces us to be hyper productive with the expectation that outproducing our peers might get us similar accolades than someone who likely doesn't produce, right? That's not even as good as we are, but we know that we are devalued. So we are working harder to just be treated the same, right? Because what we want is to just have our humanity acknowledged, our gifts acknowledged. But what ends up happening is that we get into this pattern of hyper producing so much that we then internalize that our value is in our doing, is in our work, right? And so in a country where we are often paid significantly less for same education, same skill set, that has a very negative impact on one's sense of self if that is the way that we have been conditioned to evaluate our worth, right? Is in exchange for other people's feelings. And so trauma is a full body experience. It's part of the reason that we are more likely to be, sick and have diabetes or to be obese. There are significant physical, psychological, and emotional factors or implications for this generational trauma. And so that would be, I guess, a working definition, and then one in context, I think that many of us can relate to.
Wow, like that that was a bar just there. Like there's just so much in that answer. And for me, the first time I ever heard the term intergenerational trauma or generational trauma was actually at the same conference that I met our mutual friend Rashawn at. And there was a gentleman there, and it's very unfortunate I can't remember his name, but he introduced the term to me, and I see it every day in my life. So much of what you just said, I see even in my own personal life. For example, one of my best friends, my high school teammate, is a white male, and we go to dinners or events together. And he made the joke. He goes, you're the one that went to Columbia. You're the Ivy League educated person. He didn't go to college, but he's like, but they come to me first. I get the business cards first. And the way I responded to that was, in every conversation, within the first few minutes of the conversation, I had to throw out there, oh yeah, I went to Columbia, I went to the Ivy League, to try to legitimize my worth as a person, legitimize my seat at the table at these events. And I just see so much of that in what you're saying, is that I have to work twice, 3 times as hard to feel validated in these different spaces. And just from what I've been told my whole life, you're gonna have to work hard. So to me, it's like, this is what it is, versus like, I should be worth as a human, before this. So that's
absolutely.
I just love hearing, all that you're saying and all that you're unpacking right now. This is important information. But I think it goes even deeper. And you mentioned, a toy gun, and, that gives you memories of Tamir Rice and what happened in his situation. And, more recently, we have George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. So, on a personal level, I want to ask you, how you were doing with that. What was your initial reaction? How you're processing that? And then also, like, how does that work in? Because this goes back from my parents. It was Rodney King. These names just keep continuing. Like, is this also more examples of generational trauma?
Yeah. So I think there's one, I was just numb and exhausted, because I think one of the things that this pandemic has done is it has slowed us down and has given us space to focus on things that are actually happening in our world. Whereas when we were pre-COVID, we were busy and distracted. And so although we may have heard of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud, our ability to single focus on that would have been distracted by, our extracurriculars, our work, our school, like all of these things. And so I think for many of us, the things that we thought were important got stripped away, and we were just left with ourselves and the things that actually matter, right? And so even in that space to have our humanity as people right? To be losing individuals and to have, I think that veil that we often have, that things are getting better, that these things aren't so systemic. We know it, but we get to kind of ignore it for a little bit, because otherwise, if we were aware of the reality on a day-to-day basis, it would just be too much to bear. And I think that's what happened, and why there was such an uprising was that people were distracted and they were exhausted, that it is so pervasive. And I also think that so many of us can identify personally with the experiences of all of these individuals, of not being, despite being an EMS person yourself, that it being okay that you can be killed in your home and no one is held accountable, right? That you could be crying out for help, and people who are around that are supposed to help you and intervene watch you die and do nothing, right? Or that just being in the wrong place, whatever that means, you could be hunted in this day and age. And so I think it was a numbness, and then this collective grief that we experience, I think, as not only Black people, but also people who, we have an ancestry of survivors, and yet I think we had this notion that we didn't have to be in that space anymore, that we were in a different place as a people, as a country. And this, I think, was an awakening in a way that I think people are exhausted and they're unwilling to just let up. And the things that I think we could have used to distract us, right? Like not having the time to protest or to be vocal or to even be connected, I think in a very real way, across this country, even across the world. I think all of those distractions were removed, and it created a space for us to just be together, even though we couldn't physically do so in some spaces. And so I think that has been really, really important, um, for folks to feel like there is some hope. There is a space where we can unite and we can impact change. And I pray that we don't let up anytime soon, right? But that we have to do something to kind of refill our cup so that we can do this work, this mantling work long term.
And I think, the key word there is exhaustion. And
Yes.
that's just really how I felt. For me, the first thing that really woke me up into the reality of, racial inequality, police brutality, like the fact that I could be killed and there's not swift justice. The first time made me realize like it's not the same for us was
Yeah.
Trayvon Martin, and
Yes.
that's what radicalized me. That's what got me wanting to fight. And
Yep.
then, Ferguson happened, and more names kept happening, and I was like, it always ends the same. It's always the
Always.
same outcome.
Yes.
So it
Yes.
just got to the point where I'm just like, I'm exhausted. So what tips do you have for the Black community that feels this way, that just has this feeling of despair and exhaustion? Like how do we manage this? How are we supposed to navigate these feelings?
Yeah, I think that I think one piece is to just acknowledge that um, we don't get to take our Blackness off, right? And so that also means that because we can't take it off, you are always on, but you don't always have to be out front, right? That there are so many ways that we can, I have health challenges that prevented me from being able to protest. However, um, I have access to spaces where I can utilize my voice. I have access to resources where I can donate money, where I can mobilize supplies. There's a whole host of things that don't require that you're always out front. I think it does require that we don't check out completely, right? I think it's also important that we remember that although we are, I guess, socialized as a community to give of ourselves and to serve, that you can't do so from an empty cup. I think it's also really, really important that we engage in good boundaries. And this kind of is, for me, is one of the best things you can do related to your self-care. Is again, just to know that this is a collective effort. And there are times when you might have more energy for a certain aspect than I have energy for, and to give yourself permission to do what's in your zone of genius and to be in alignment with where your energy is. Because we burn out if we don't manage that properly, right? And we're no good to ourselves or to the initiative if we light ourselves on fire to keep other people warm, right? And so I think that piece is important, is to just know that we're not doing this none of us are doing this in isolation. Be in community. We do our best work when we are connected with one another. That also means that sometimes you're pushing and other times you're pulling, but that we're always doing that in coordination with one another. And so get in community if you're not in one.
And that's exactly right. Like I love how you said you can't pour from an empty cup. So what do you do specifically to help replenish your cup? Like what are some of the like routine things you do for your own self-care to help you stay regulated?
One of the things that I do is in how I start my day. So I'm a God girl, so prayer is a part of what I do. It's a part of my daily routine. So after that time period, right? So I spend time in prayer and in journaling every morning. But kind of after that is I then give myself time. So for me, I start my day off in service to myself, filling my cup. Because what happens is that I notice when I start my day off on social media or an email, it immediately puts me in a space where I'm answering tasks other people have for me, and they get to set the tone for my day. And so think about how you're starting your day. Are you starting your day on someone else's to-do list, right? And so that is a big piece. I also, especially in being inundated in the grief and trauma space as a professional, but also as a Black woman and parents of Black children, it's important for me that I don't watch any of the videos. I don't watch any of the videos. I don't watch any content that is potentially triggering or um, that displays any kind of violence. That is my kind of rule. Because we don't often account for the fact that vicarious trauma, so trauma that happens to us as a bystander, as a witness to other folks suffering, has the same effect. Your body doesn't know that you are safe. It has the same traumatic response as if it were happening to you. So watching the video gets imprinted and encoded in your brain and in your body, the same activation that you'd experience if it happened to you, that shows up in your body. And so that's another way that I engage in self-care is by monitoring what I am consuming and how much. And then the last piece is having good boundaries. People who have really good self-care are okay with saying no, and allowing it to be a complete sentence, right? And so that also allows you to conserve your energy, and resources, money, time, emotions, what have you, so that you are not depleted. And so boundaries are really, really important. And I always remind people that the folks who have a problem with your boundaries are usually the ones who benefit from you not having any. And so really think about what that means. We are constantly on for everyone in our life, and then who's on for us, who's available for us. And so do that for you first. It also teaches other people how to treat you, right? And so those are some things that I think are really important on this journey.
Those are amazing tips. There's so much there that I wish I could just touch on. I want to touch on every single one of those tips, but thank you so much for that. Especially, you know, that you just taught me something new, like vicarious trauma, because I myself have not watched the full video, and I'm not someone that normally, like turns away from things. I normally, embrace it all, but brutality and those videos I just can't watch. So, it makes sense now, like that you taught me the whole meaning behind why it's just so hard for me to watch those specific videos. So thank you for that.
And we don't have to. I think sometimes we think that in order to bear witness to their life, right, to the injustice, that we have to watch it. But what we really want to do is to be able to honor them, right? And that doesn't require that we put ourselves at risk by watching the video. And then here's what happens is that although I don't watch the video, you see the news clips. I've never watched the video, but I have vivid details about what happens because people keep talking about it in vivid details. And so what happens is that your brain fills in the gap. So although I didn't see the video, I still have an image, right? My brain can recall because you've heard the story about what happened over and over again, which can be as traumatic, right? Again, the brain and the body doesn't know that the cue came from direct experiencing versus the indirect or the vicarious piece, whether it is through the video or the reading or the storytelling. And so we have to be mindful of the stories we tell one another in conversation and the stories we tell ourselves, because that can reinforce some of the trauma response we might be having. And so again, that's just a part of the self-care and being aware of what shows up in your own body.
I think it's so important that we because I mean, as someone that's young in this space, but really trying to embrace mental health space, vicarious trauma is just a term I've yet to hear before. I think it's important because that's something we need to legitimize. I think growing up, for me, I never wanted to be the kid where you watch a tough movie that requires permission slip, and those kids that had to leave the classroom. Like, I never understood that. I never, you know, honestly, being candid, legitimize that. I thought that these things are usually experienced. If tough things are happening in the world, I felt it was my duty to experience them, because if someone out there is experiencing it, at least I can do is watch it. But to
Mm.
legitimize my, pushback into watching or being told these stories is really mind blowing for me right now. So
Yeah.
it's amazing to hear, like the term vicarious trauma, all the terms that you mentioned. But I mean, this has been a really tough conversation. I appreciate you for being so honest and candid. So I want to end on a positive note. And yeah, at Flawless, we have this concept of a flawless world. And you can look at it as, something that gives you hope for a better world. So I want to ask, what does a flawless world look like to you? Or right now, like, what is giving you hope that we'll see a more flawless world?
My clients will tell you that I am the holder of hope. That's what they call me. And so even in the midst of chaos, I am hopeful. And so I think the thing that is giving me hope is that I think that we are in a space as a country, as a people, where we are really connected. We're really, I think, in tune with one another. I think that we are seeing each other in a very different way for the first time, in a way that is just creating space and collective community. And that gives me a lot of hope, not just as Black people, but I think as people in general. I think that that is being amplified right now. And I think that there are more people who understand the value of diversity and the value of dismantling white supremacy and of equity than there are individuals that are fighting against it. And so that gives me tremendous hope that not only will we get to a space where all people are honored and seen and protected, that we will also get to a place where some of the things that we're fighting against will no longer be necessary.
That's beautiful. Well, I thank you for finding the time. I know you've been super busy lately, but for finding the time to sit down and talk with me. I've learned a lot in this short 20 or 30-minute conversation, so I appreciate you for that. For all those watching, if you want more from Dr. Robinson, we will make sure to have her social media and her website posted so that you can follow her and get in contact and learn more about her. So, Dr. Robinson, thank you so much for spending the time and speaking with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was a pleasure.